My hope for this afternoon is that you'll be validated in a lot of your understandings, that perhaps you'll have some new awarenesses, but especially that you'll have some new ways to think about this thing called trauma and how it affects people. The reality is that when a traumatic experience happens, it's mostly confusing. And it confuses the person who's the direct target of it, but it confuses everyone around them, including by the time they get to work with us, it can be quite confusing to us. So my hope is to give some of the leading edge understandings of trauma, to do it in a way that we understand it pretty clearly, but also in a way that you could communicate it to others. Because what good is it if we all understand trauma? Feel quite happy about that. If we can't pass this on to the folks who need to know it, it's happening to them. They want to understand it and what to do about it and how to feel okay around it. Well, we need to become really good teachers in those moments. And so I hope that some of the ways that I present it will give you some new ways to teach it and to talk about it. This coming September, I will be celebrating my 50th year of doing this work. Right? The thing that amazes me, not that I'm still here, but that amazes me, but the more things change, the more they stay the same. We are now discovering things that we took for granted back in the 1960s in doing work with people. We lost it along the way because we were under enormous pressure to treat people much more quickly, much more uniformly, much more cheaply, and to just get on with it. And there was a huge convergence of factors that caused people doing the work to shrink back from doing really deep and meaningful work. Part of it is they were burnt out because they never heard about trauma in their own training. It wasn't even in the lexicon of mental health officially until 1983. Imagine I worked for over 20 years before the word trauma could be used in my case conferences with colleagues, or that I could use it with a patient. And what were we doing during those 20 years? I mean, we knew we were working with heavy-duty stuff. But we knew a lot of things back then about how much effort it takes, how the principle that we used back then when working with severely wounded people was that the slower you go, the more progress you make. The slower you go, the more progress you make, and the faster you get there. And I hope that some of the theoretical stuff I present this afternoon will give you some way to justify that and to think about your own work and how you might really work back towards some of that old principle. How do we slow some things down with the huge press to rush things forward? My hope for this afternoon is that you'll be validated in a lot of your understandings, that perhaps you'll have some new awarenesses, but especially that you'll have some new ways to think about this thing called trauma and how it affects people. So I'm going to start this story by talking about this so-called healthy human. This notion of what is healthy, what does it mean to be a healthy human, is an old notion. I mean ancient, back into ancient civilizations and into the teachings of Aboriginal people. And what we get from it is that to be healthy is not just to have a healthy body, but a healthy human, and certainly as it refers to trauma, is one who has a integrated, interconnected set of domains or subsystems that work together, inform each other, and make the experience of this being a whole experience, a cohesive experience. Now, if one is balanced in this way, as you go through life, all parts of you are picking up data. Your mind, your emotions, your body movements, your viscera, your social relationships. You are sensing, perceiving on an internal and external way what this is all about. And with the benefit of all of those receptors communicating with one another, you get a very rich sense of what it's all about. And from that, we get meaning. We understand who we are. We understand what's happening. We understand, what it's all about. So some would say that at the core of this multidimensional self, there is a driving principle. There's something that's at work in the center of all of this, keeping that balance going. And if you're spiritually inclined, some people would say that's their spirit or their soul. But psychologically minded people will understand that as the self or the psyche, maybe the personality, the uniqueness of who we are is in that center place. And if we go through an experience with all of these parts working together, we will retain that experience pretty much as it was. When we say that they're talking to each other, we mean that if the mind comes up with an image, the emotion that goes with that image will also come up. And the body sensation that comes up with that image and that emotion also comes up. And one might even remember some relational moment where all of that happened. So that there is a benefit to having these parts inform one another. We're also designed, however, to not just pick up pleasant things in our environment, but to sense where there's danger, to sense threat. And when our being first senses it, it generally is through the capacities of the mind. The mind very quickly gets all the data, analyzes the data, goes back into the filing cabinet and looks for data that gives some information about that, and it can assess it and call it danger. If it does that, and it does it very quickly, it sends signals throughout the rest of the system to respond to this threat and this danger. If you're healthy, and I'm assuming we all are more or less healthy, we have a pretty high capacity to withstand these dangerous stimuli around us. We hold ourselves together in the midst of this danger, and in fact we take in that danger in a very whole way, and afterwards we're quite able to talk about it and share about it and remember what we felt about it, because we held ourselves together in the midst of it. In fact, if you're first responders and you go on the scene, it requires that you're holding yourself whole in the face of what you're experiencing, what you're seeing, and what's coming at you. To the extent that you can maintain that wholeness while you're there, you're going to be the most productive and the most efficient, the most organized, the best problem solver, the best planner, being able to anticipate consequences, and you're going to also be in touch of what you need in the process. Your body will send signals to you. You may feel sweaty or a heartbeat accelerating or your breathing changing, and you will take that information and do something to adjust. Take a moment, step back, slow down, take some breaths, step away from it, because you're getting this whole being report about what needs to happen. If in fact you hold yourself together following this incident, somewhere an hour later, the next day, the next week, you will still be able to talk about that. You will have all the pieces available to you. And you can bring up the images, the sounds, the emotions, the body sensations, the relational things that you were experiencing, and you'll have the meaning of it all in one sort of coherent whole. It remains with you. There are times, and it's very, very individual, where the danger crosses some threshold. some invisible line, some line that is unique to us. And it crosses the line from just simply danger that I can negotiate through to a traumatic experience that I'm not able to negotiate through. Why it crosses that line in that moment is very particularly about you. It's about how whole you are to begin with, whether you've had practice at this sort of thing before, so you kind of know what to expect. But it also has something to do with the event itself. Some events are just too horrific that almost anyone is going to be destabilized by them. And some of it has to do with your genes, believe it or not, and your personality and your mental health status and a whole variety of variables. But the bottom line is, when this is happening to this person and it is sensed as traumatic, it's very difficult for any of us on the outside to know why this is traumatic for this person. And it's very difficult for us to say with 100% certainty that that was a traumatic experience. It is that individual. And if the same event took place right here in the middle of this room, we would have 100 different reactions to it. Some of us will be traumatized by it. Some of us will be upset by it. Some of us will be curious about it. Some of us, it'll linger with us. Others will kind of think about it for the rest of the day and be over with. And some of us will forget about it rather quickly. How we go through that individual response is somewhat mysterious, but it's also some of the work of helping people recover from it. Right? Why was this traumatic for them? What did it mean to them? Because trauma, if nothing else, attacks that meaning place. It goes to that place where you say to yourself, this is just not the way it's supposed to be. This is not how I thought of life. This is not how I imagine I would be going through something. This is something that is outside of your usual sense of what it means to be human, to be okay, to live in a home and be safe, to walk down a street and be safe, to go to a school and be safe. You have a certain meaning sense. Trauma will challenge that meaning. And afterwards, folks are needing to get some of that meaning back, right? They're needing to incorporate some new information, but they want still some way to get some meaning out of it, right? How often do we see folks following a tragedy in their family? We see the Newtown shootings, right? How quickly the community organizes to try to get meaning. These deaths will not be in vain. We will change the gun laws. We will create more awareness. Life will never be the same for them. They've had to expand their sense of what it means to be a functioning family and community member. But to the extent that they can do that, they will pull their wholeness back together again. And if they can't do that, if that eludes them, they'll remain fractured and fragmented, and we'll see where that goes. So as folks who are working with folks that may have had trauma occur to them, it's very challenging for us as an outsider to be the one that says, yes, they were traumatized, or no, they weren't. That really needs to come very collaboratively with them. We have to really hear lots of information before we can say that. We can't give them a quick checklist. Have you ever experienced this, experienced that, experienced this? Oh yes, you've got trauma. Can't do it that way. You almost have to develop a relationship with people before you can answer the question of whether they were traumatized. In fact, if people were traumatized in relationships, the only way to really support them is through a helping relationship. Right? Medications aren't going to do it. Wonderful exercise is not going to do it. Nutrition, blah, blah, blah. They need a corrective emotional relationship. And that's what you often provide, whether you call it that or not. I mean, the reason is simple. If you fall off a horse as a kid and it really traumatizes you, well, you can live your life quite happily avoiding horses. Right? Just don't go near them anymore. And your functioning will not be diminished. If, however, you were harmed by another human being, and you're not quite sure even if that harm was intentional, right? Big question for victims, right? Did they intend to harm me? Was I their special target? Did they have it in for me in some way? Often they just want an answer to that question. Could go a long way for them. But when that harm has been relational, there's a whole series of defensive patterns that one starts in one's life that makes further relationships quite challenging. It's worse if the trauma was at the hands of someone who was supposed to take care of you, right? Betrayal trauma, we would call it. Someone is in the position of otherwise looking after you, but instead they harm you. The meaning aspects of that really get pretty mucked up. How does one come to terms with that? You know, person's supposed to care for me, but they hurt me. I love them, but I'm afraid of them. They seem to love me, but they punish me. I mean, the meaning gets muddled. We come on the scene with all of our good intentions, and we have to believe that if we do nothing else with this person, we have to not reinforce that kind of thinking about a relationship. Whatever is coming up in front of us in this relationship, we have to do the unexpected. We have to not judge, not criticize, not scold, not harm, not, shame. They've had enough of that. They need a moment where the right things happen, and the right energy gets exchanged. And that doesn't fix it all, but it plants a little seed that maybe could grow. And you're going to have to stay at that. Now, when this trauma happens, we're no longer in that idyllic, balanced interconnection of parts. We have some sort of a fracturing that takes place. The experience is overwhelming to that whole system, and the whole system might even go crazy if it stayed whole during the experience. And to some extent, it very protectively loosens up its communication amongst themselves so that they take it in more peace-like. So that the mind takes in certain aspects of it, but it doesn't trigger the emotions. The emotion takes in other aspects, but it doesn't bring up images. The body is going through bodily sensations, but it's not creating emotional responses or behavioral responses because all these parts are kind of on their own. Now that's a survival strategy, and in fact it's an automatic mechanism. The net effect, if this is a traumatic experience, is that at the same time that this breakup is occurring, there is also a tendency to pull the parts back together going on at the same time. In other words, at the very moment of being traumatized and victimized, there is triggered a healing process as well. And that healing process can be supported just as when you show up right there on the scene and you give some reassurance, you support that healing process. When you come up on the scene and whatever, the person just needs a blanket and you provide that blanket, that healing process gets supported. When it's a week later and you're sitting in a room and they're talking and they're crying and you're being kind and you offer them some tissues and get a glass of water, you're supporting that healing process because that's built in. We're hardwired. Just as we're hardwired to respond to trauma, we're hardwired to initiate a healing process at the same time. In the very same way as our body, right? Cut your finger, the instant that cut begins, wonderful blood chemicals flow to the scene. We get lots of cortisol there, helping the tissues to mend instantly as the cut is happening. We can support that healing, do the right thing for it, and it will continue to do its work. We keep cutting it, keep opening it. We keep frustrating that healing process, and eventually that healing tendency weakens and slows down. So what happens here? This person is unfortunately stuck. The trauma has been too much for them, and these parts are not working together. On their own, they don't function efficiently. They end up being out of balance. We say they get dysregulated. The mind starts having all kinds of thoughts that are not accurate. This was my fault, right? I deserve this. I didn't protect myself well enough. I should have run. I should have fought back. I should have, would have, could have. The mind starts playing tricks of self-blame, right? It's never going to get better. I'm always going to feel this way. I can't trust anybody. There's no help out there for me. The mind will develop cognitive distortions because it's out there working sort of on its own, trying to figure things out. It's not taking in all the data. The emotions start surging. And without having any maybe memory of where that emotion comes from, one misunderstands that emotion. So that when Billy went to school, he was described as being ADHD, right? But in a classroom environment where there's lots of noise and lots of stimulation, Billy might be feeling an emotional reaction similar to what it was like when there were drunken parties going on back home. But he doesn't see that. He just feels this emotional stuff coming up, which is fear. And he's going to react to that in some way, perhaps by getting agitated, by getting hyper, by starting to interfere with other kids, by even bullying other kids and getting the distraction off his own fear. Right? So there's an emotional response that's taking place because it doesn't really have the benefit of being balanced out by the facts. Billy can't sense, oh, this is not my home. That teacher does not mean to come over and hurt me. The other kids are not here to have a drunken party and frighten me. He doesn't have that ability to put it in perspective. And that's what happens with the other parts. As this meaning-making function fails to kick in again, why the body will also have bodily lingering reactions. Following trauma, people might first notice their body signs. First notice that they're jumpy. You know, they can feel the agitation. They're restless. They can't sleep. They're having digestion issues. They're having heart racing. They're all manners of physical signs that are, you know, bells that are ringing that are saying something can't get regulated again. You're acting as if you're in that moment of danger and trauma. Your body is reacting as if it's in that place, even though the event is past. And then, of course, social relationships, if you're living like that, are going to be a challenge. So the first thing that happens about something that makes it traumatic is that it's unexpected, almost by definition. You didn't wake up in this, the morning saying, I'm going to have trauma today. You were living your life, going about business, whatever that might be, when this unforeseen thing took place. Because it was so unexpected, and your mind was on other things, your psychological defenses are down. And so you're vulnerable by the very fact that you're not expecting this thing to happen. Well, what does that say to me? It says, what if we could get more ready and expect it more? Right? So for workers, for example, it would be really good if you woke up each morning expecting traumatic events to take place. Right? I mean, it's kind of a given. Today we're going to have trauma. I wonder what trauma it's going to be today, right? I wonder when it's going to happen because it's going to sneak up on me and surprise me, right? I can't be totally ready for it. But believe it or not, that little bit of readiness goes a long way to keeping your psychological defenses up. It's also tiring to have to do that all the time. As you know that, you know. Some of the other implications are, if you're going out on a scene or you're going to be meeting a client or entering a circle, wouldn't it be good if you were prepared for what it was that was going to happen? Because the more prepared you are, the more you'll be able to stay whole and integrated and high functioning through that. But if you go in there totally unprepared for what's going to happen or what you're going to see, why that fracturing takes place and you lose your own stability. And that's the place of burnout. That's where we start tiring out, developing that so-called compassion fatigue. We let this unexpected thing in and it's overwhelming us. So I say, to whatever extent possible, even if you're a first responder, if you could get some information every step of the way before you even arrived on the scene as to what you might see, you'll be more resilient to the trauma. Okay. The thing about trauma is that it's not just a bad hair day, right? It's something that you perceive or you experience as highly threatening. In fact, the threat could be of a real life-threatening nature, or some real other kind of threat, some real threat to who you are, to that sense of meaning. Doesn't have to be a gun to your head, right? A woman miscarries. It might be difficult. She gets over it, tries to get pregnant again, and it was just a tough period. Another woman miscarries, and it's traumatic for her. And we can't look at the two and say, well, gee, how come one and how come... We have to ask, what was the meaning that that miscarriage had for the woman who's traumatized? What, in fact, threat did that pose? What danger did it pose? What almost life risk was posed there? And if we ask those kinds of questions, we often get a little bit more information. So it is about perception, which makes it particularly difficult for kids and even teenagers, because without the same cognitive skills and the same life experience, they could perceive life threat even if it's not there. And they can be over-responsive to it, thinking that their life is always at risk. One reaction would be to become very fearful and avoidant and, try to keep your head down. Nobody notices you. Another might be to work the opposite way and not show your fear, to, in fact, act aggressively, right? To cover that fear, kind of a counterphobic reaction. So perception is really important here, but it's also very individual. The other thing about it is that by definition, again, it's inescapable. You're cornered, right? There's no way out. If there was a way out, you'd take it and it'd be over with and done. But trauma is something that, for whatever reason, your feet are nailed to the ground as this thing is happening to you. And to that extent, you're overpowered by it. You're not able to get away. The inescapable nature doesn't mean people won't try to escape. Following trauma, people forget some of the good strategies that they engaged in. Some of the life-saving, creative thinking, really smart kinds of moves that they made, because those moves didn't work. They got creative, they tried things, they begged, they pleaded, they joked, they tried to pretend they were sick, they fainted, and nothing worked. The trauma happened anyway. Afterwards, though, they only remember the failure, that they didn't protect themselves. They have a hard time recreating memories of the good things they tried. The net result is they feel generally kind of powerless and helpless, when in fact they weren't. They were trying things, and maybe those things were very creative things, but the nature of this overpowering force was such that those things were doomed to failure. So trauma overpowers them, simply said. It overpowers, it is about a power imbalance, no matter how you look at it, whether it's a man-made trauma, an accident, natural disaster, there is something overpowering about it, and that's part of what makes it dramatic. Now, your usual way of coping with things, we all have ways that we deal with stuff. And whatever those ways are, however we engage them, those ways will often get tried during a traumatic experience. The problem is they're not enough. Those usual coping styles, mechanisms, tricks, ways don't work, don't fit. At the end of which one again feels, powerless. I couldn't help myself. I didn't protect myself. And one will kind of get stuck in a loop of thinking about, what could I have done differently? What did I do wrong? Because obviously I failed in that moment. The other thing is that automatic responses get triggered. So this is one of the things about trauma. And if it's the one place for us to look at some certainty about whether or not an experience was traumatic, this is where we start to look. Did a series of automatic responses get triggered? And we're going to look at those, right? Because we're hardwired to respond to it. Okay. The other thing is that regardless of the trauma, something significant gets lost. The loss might be obvious. Somebody breaks into my home and steals some precious family things. I can list those things for the police report, and those losses are tangible. But what else did I lose? That's not so easy to see. Sense of safety, right? A sense that this home is a place where I can, be safe and guarantee my precious family things will be protected. So those losses, those less tangible losses, are often where people get stuck in trying to recover. They're not really identifying those non-tangible losses. And sometimes that takes quite a bit of conversation, quite a bit of listening, so that eventually they get to that bottom veil that says, these are the things that I lost, right? And so that's probably a key to working with trauma survivors. How to help them identify those losses and in some way get them back. Some way, some real way, some representational way, but some way that makes them feel like that which was taken away has now satisfactorily been replaced. And that can mean all kinds of things. But it's very individual. The other thing about trauma is that the effects will linger. We don't know how long. A person says to me, how long am I going to feel this bad? Well, I don't know. I know that this can change. It can get better. I know it can get so much better that eventually you're going to feel okay. That's a real possibility. I want to give them that assurance. In mental health, we've often been told not to give people any of those kinds of reassurances, right? That's not really true with trauma survivors and the kind of people you maybe encounter. They need some reassurances, not to the extent of false hope or something totally unrealistic. Everything's going to be great someday, you'll see. No. But, if we keep working at this, I keep supporting you, you keep doing your part, things can get better and better and better. Right? So how long do they linger? We don't know. A lot of it depends on whether or not there's going to be any more trauma or whether the person will have a breather from it and begin to reconnect, reintegrate those broken parts. What are we saying here? We're saying that if this is a single traumatic event that one goes through, and life is fortunate for them, and thereafter nothing bad happens. We can pretty much predict that anyone who has a major single traumatic event or has widely separated traumatic events will recover mostly on their own. A little bit of support goes a long way. That support is usually personal support, family support, friend support, sometimes professional support. But if a person has had a single traumatic event or widely spaced traumatic events, they will often reintegrate themselves. Not be totally the same. In fact, they might even in some ways be better following those. How many people following an awful experience in life, somewhere down the road, will say, you know, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, but it really taught me some things. I grew because of it. I increased my level of understanding of others. I improved in my compassion. They say something good came of it. In fact, when they poll people who've had horrific life events, and they ask them to say whether or not anything positive ever came from those things, the vast majority of people say yes. Caution. In the middle of the crisis, in the middle of the trauma, you don't go, you'll see, you'll be a better person for this. You know? Lots of people have been through this, and they do much better later on, you know. No. But isn't that useful for us to know as helpers? That right now, this picture that we're seeing of gloom and doom and nothing's ever going to get better, with support and with the right amount of self-reflection, this person could end up even in better shape than they were before. So that's one of the things to say about it.